Is my voice making it to the back? Great. Welcome to our talk tonight. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. So on behalf of President Smatras, my colleagues at Brookings Mountain West, all of us at UNLV, welcome to what is actually it's our last lecture of the semester and calendar year. I guess that goes hand in hand. We will start up again in January with a spring series. I hope we'll be able to see all of you for those. I guess everybody wanted to be happy tonight. We got or miserable, I guess is. That's your problem, Carol. You have to decide that. Thank you again for coming. We have Carol Graham with us tonight. Carol's not new to Las Vegas, but she's new as a visiting Brookings scholar here. It's even her first day here, so we put her right to work. But she'll be meeting, as all our scholars do, with UNLV faculty and students and people across the community. I think you're in for a treat tonight on a topic that might seem a little unusual at first, but Carol's going to explain to you her interesting field of research. Just a couple of commercials. We have a flyer. Carol's talk is derived from her book of the same title. We have a flyer out on the table out front if you didn't pick one up that will give you more information on the book, including how to obtain it, either in print or electronically. We also have a flyer out front at Brookings Mountain West. We released an economic study of the state of Nevada yesterday. It's getting some attention in the media, working with the governor, the secretary of state, and leaders across Nevada to try and help create a new economic development strategy for the state. There's a flyer out there to lead you to that report. You'll have time to read that before we get back together. So that's the end of my commercials. For you people sitting on the ends, as I like to do, since we have such a crowd tonight, you may need to help let people by you to squeeze in for some of our late arrivals. So I hope you won't mind doing that. And with that, let me formally introduce Carol Graham, a senior fellow at Brookings, who's a well-regarded and well-known and published scholar on economics, and particularly this topic. Carol?
Thanks, Bill. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And I hope, I don't know if you saved the best for last, but maybe it was the happiest for last anyway, in terms of the lecture series. So I have been, indeed, I started off as an economist many years ago, just working on poverty and inequality, particularly in the developing world, but also in the United States. But for about 10 years, for reasons I can tell you in the questions if you're more interested in this, I've been studying happiness around the world, basically the determinants of happiness or well-being all over the world. I published 2 books in the past couple of years. Bill mentioned, I don't know which one they're advertising outside, but there's one called Happiness Around the World, The Paradox of Happy Peasants and Miserable Millionaires, like the title of the talk, and a more recent one called The Pursuit of Happiness, An Economy of Well-being that Brookings just published in its focus book series, and that's really about the policy implications of all this. And when I started on this venture about 10 years ago, if I'd even put happiness and policy in the same sentence, people would have laughed. Indeed, when I wrote another book on happiness came out in 2002, so about 10 years ago, my colleague and friend, the then director of economic studies at Brookings, said, Carol, this is a great manuscript, but you've got to take happiness out of the title because nobody will take you seriously. Well, since then, for any number of reasons, in part because more and more economists have been using these kinds of data and survey methods, and in part because I think people are thinking about the extent to which our economic models have succeeded or failed, all of a sudden happiness is all over the place. And in the past, just to give you some examples, in the past year, I've been on a panel at the World Economic Forum at Davos, a keynote address at the American Economics Association. The talk about happiness and policy is no longer just talk, but indeed many countries in the world, from the remote Bhutan to the far less remote Great Britain, are implementing well-being metrics in their statistics. And most recently, I'm involved or a part of a National Academy of Sciences panel, which is discussing which well-being metrics are the most relevant to apply to US statistics, including the US Census. So for those of us that were lonely warriors studying happiness about 12 to 10 years ago, we've come a long way, baby, as they would say. But anyway, it's still a new field. There are lots of, it raises as many questions as it's able to answer. And I hope in the next hour I can tell you a little bit about the approach that we use to study well-being or happiness, and then how it might help inform public policy questions and all sorts of other research questions as well. For this particular lecture, and I think one of the big challenges to the literature, I'm going to focus on the question of how some individuals who are destitute report to be happy, while others who are very wealthy report to be miserable. They're in the Happy Peasants and Miserable Millionaires in the title of the book. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the role of norms and adaptation in explaining this seeming puzzle. So adaptation is the subject of much economics work, but the definition is essentially psychological. So adaptations are defense mechanisms, and they're bad ones like paranoia, and then there are lots of healthy adaptation mechanisms like humor, anticipation, and sublimation. Psychologists debate something called the set point theory quite viscerally. The set point theory basically says that people can adapt to anything, such as bad health, divorce, poverty, crime and corruption, becoming a quadriplegic, and return to their set point of cheerfulness or happiness. The idea is that everybody has some sort of natural set point, and they can always adapt back to that. And you all know, just among the people you know, there are people that are just naturally curmudgeonly, and there are people that are naturally cheerful. And that is indeed something that we find across population distributions. But it's not clear that people really can adapt to everything and always return back to their set point. There's a lot of debate about that. There's a lot of economics work that shows that there are lots of things that people don't fully adapt back from. One of those things is actually long-term unemployment, which is pretty relevant to the current economic context. But whether or not you believe the set point theory and that people completely adapt is almost irrelevant in my view. We do know that people are remarkably adaptable. And indeed, my studies suggest that people can adapt to extreme adversity. So I did the first study of happiness in Afghanistan about 2 years ago, and I found that people in Afghanistan are as happy as people, respondents in Latin America are, and they're 20% more likely to smile in a day in Afghanistan than are people in Cuba. Meanwhile, objective conditions in Afghanistan are much, much worse than they are in either Latin America or Cuba specifically. Meanwhile, we find that Kenyans are as satisfied with their health care as Americans are, even though, you know, by objective health standards, Kenya's health standards are far, far worse. So people can adapt to adversity and maintain some sort of cheerfulness or positiveness. And at first look, how can this not be a good thing? Well, it may be from an individual perspective, so that people can adapt to adversity and maintain their natural cheerfulness and get on with their life. That's clearly probably a very good thing from an individual perspective. But as I've been studying these things around the world, I'm starting to think that this wonderful human capacity to adapt may also allow for collective tolerance for bad equilibrium. And I'm going to show you some examples in the lecture in the area of economics, crime and corruption, and health. And you'll see this has real implications for the ongoing debate about how to use metrics for reported well-being or reported happiness in the policy arena. They can inform a lot of things, but they also, I think, pose some challenges. So first of all, what is happiness economics? It's a new method within economics. It grew out of behavioral economics, which combines the tools and methods of economists with those typically used by psychologists. And it's able, in doing so, it's able to capture broader elements of welfare than just do income data alone. Basically, all we do is listen to what people say instead of only focusing on what people choose to consume. So standard economics is based on the assumption that you can't believe what people say because there's no consequence to what people say. So you can only look at the data that comes from consumption choices made within a budget constraint, so that people have to have a trade-off. If they consume A versus B, then they've made a trade-off, and that's a real choice, and you can believe that data. Well, it turns out that what behavioral economics showed is basically that people make a lot of consumption choices that are perverse, that are bad for their welfare, like smoking cigarettes or whatever else it might be. And also that sometimes people can't make choices because they're limited in their capacity or their information. So with happiness economics, we look at surveys of reported well-being, how people answer surveys about how happy they are or how satisfied they are with their life, and we can correlate that to all kinds of other things about their lives and determine what makes them happy or not. And the method is uniquely well suited for analyzing questions where revealed preferences don't provide good answers, questions that have typically defied standard economic models. There are two areas that I work on in particular. One is the welfare effects of institutional arrangements individuals are powerless to change, like inequality or macroeconomic volatility. And I like to give the example of a poor peasant in Bolivia who's made unhappy by inequality or by bad governance. Well, short of emigrating or protesting, which are pretty dramatic revealed preferences, the poor peasant probably can't do much about either inequality or bad governance, and yet either of those conditions may make he or she very unhappy. So we can get at that with happiness surveys in a way that you can't get at that by looking at consumption data. And secondly, there are whole sets of behaviors that are driven by norms or by addiction and self-control problems. So people's choices may not be reflecting optimal welfare choices. So I've done some work looking at obesity, for example. Why are the obese less happy than the non-obese? If it was just a revealed preference, then they would be happier, right? There's some studies of smoking that show cigarette taxes make smokers happier in Canada. Again, this seems crazy from a traditional economics perspective. They're choosing to smoke and to consume, so a tax will make them less happy. But if you think of smoking as a self-control problem, then you get a very different take on the question. And then finally, I look at behaviors or choices where people don't have choice. They don't have the capacity to make a choice. Take, for example, a person from a lower caste in India who chooses not to send his or her child to school. Is that really a choice, or is it the result of a very strong norm that says you're going to stay in the caste you're in? The school isn't very good quality. It doesn't make a lot of sense to send your child to school. It's hard to call that a kind of a revealed preference or an optimal choice, but rather a behavior that's imposed by a very strong norm that may actually be welfare reducing. And again, we can look at that. So a couple of other things have made us much more confident about using these survey data. One is just the consistent patterns that we find in the determinants of happiness or well-being across large samples, across countries and across time. So that these data, there's consistency in them, in the patterns in them, so people aren't answering all off the charts. The way people answer happiness or well-being surveys correlates with a lot of the variables that we know cause higher levels of well-being. And then psychologists find what they call validation in the way people answer these surveys. So when people who say they're happier typically have more genuine smiles, they have their frontal lobes in the brain that operate differently when people are happier or not, and these correlate with the way people answer these surveys. And then secondly, we've gotten much more sophisticated with econometrics, and we can actually account for the error and bias in survey data in ways that we couldn't before, and that's also helping us get at more robust usage of this data. And then finally, one of the things that I think survey data gets criticized a lot by traditional economists for being very noisy, having lots of error in it. But I happen to know what underlies the income data, particularly for developing countries, and talk about noise and bias. A lot of the income data that we use, that we assume is good data, is full of all kinds of bias. And in the most extreme rebuttal, I would argue that given that a lot of income data is based on expenditure surveys, that people have a lot less incentive to misreport or to lie to a happiness survey than they do to an income survey, particularly in countries where answering an income survey a certain way may have tax consequences, right? So I'm not so convinced that income data is really better than survey data. Anyway, we are forging on and using it. Now, if I don't get this backwards, good, I'm getting this right. I will say there are some reasons to be cautious. One is biases in the way that people answer surveys that can be caused by question ordering or by random events. So you really want the happiness survey to be the first one. It's an open-ended question about happiness or life satisfaction. It should be the first question in the survey you're asking. If you ask people how happy they are after 10 questions about is their job good or bad, or what's their marriage like, or whatever it might be, you could be biasing their answer by framing it, right? And then another issue is random events. If you interviewed UNLV students the day after UNLV lost to, I don't know, what's your biggest football rival? You might get a downward bias in the survey. Or if you asked, I'm from Peru, if you asked Peruvians the day they lost to Chile in the World Cup, you'd definitely get a bias downward in the average happiness score. So you have to watch out for things like that. But those are surmountable problems. A much more difficult problem and a challenge for this whole line of research, and I think a challenge for development policy more generally, is this whole issue of adaptation. So at the individual level, if a poor peasant who's adapted to his or her condition or has low aspirations reports that he or she is happy, how is this information relevant to policy, right? I mean, how do you compare that data point to a millionaire who has everything within his or her means, good health, lots of money, good living, lots of opportunities, and reports to be miserable? How do you compare those two data points? Well, I'll get into that a little more, but that's a challenge. That's kind of the adaptation challenge. And then at the country level, there's something called the Easterlin paradox, which Richard Easterlin was the first modern economist to study happiness a couple of decades ago. And what he found is that average happiness levels did not increase as rich countries got richer. And they also were not just getting richer, but that were making improvements in other areas, such as health and education. So to give you some examples, Japan quintupled its income in 3 decades, and average happiness levels fell. The US grew dramatically until a couple of years ago, and average happiness levels stayed flat. So there's a lot of renewed debate now on the Easterlin paradox. It's actually quite visceral because some other economists, based on a different data set and a different happiness question, are finding a more linear correlation between average per capita levels of GDP and average country levels of happiness. I'm not going to get into that because I would spend the whole rest of the time on that debate. My contribution to that debate is to show that the findings that you get depend a lot on the question or the definition of happiness that's used. So if you use a more framed question, like how does your life compare to the best possible life, then people's respondents correlate much more closely with their income levels, because it's a relative question, than if you just ask an open-ended, generally speaking, how happy are you with your life question, and that correlates much less closely with income. But just to show you how complicated this is, this is average per capita levels of GDP on the horizontal axis, and this is percent above neutral on a life general open-ended how satisfied are you with your life question on the vertical axis. And if you look at this chart, we could have a pretty intense debate in this room about whether there was an Easterlin paradox or not, because you could draw 2 different conclusions. You could say, well, look, the rich countries are clearly happier than the poor countries, no Easterlin paradox. But if you look among the samples of countries, you'll notice there's absolutely no relationship at all between per capita levels of income and average happiness levels. Certainly among the poor countries, there's even more variance than in the rich countries. But even in the rich countries, the US is the wealthiest country, I think, on that chart, and certainly not the happiest. There's a real lack of correlation. So in part, it depends on the question that's used. In part, this is due to the fact that when you just take average country scores, which is something that gets a lot of media attention, people want to know where their country ranks. Are we number 1? So we want to know if we're number 1 in happiness, right? But when you just take these average scores, you're also not controlling for just cultural differences in the way people answer surveys. Okay, so for example, France. the French, my grandmother was from Paris, they take pride in being a little bit curmudgeonly. They're not going to tell you, have a good day when you buy a croissant. In fact, they might growl at you, right? But that doesn't mean they're necessarily less happy. But when you average out their scores, right, and you compare them to the cheerful, in the Netherlands, my ex-husband's from the Netherlands. I spent a fair amount of time there, and people are very proud when they say good morning. It's sort of a cheerful cultural lilt in the way people answer things. That sort of, those differences make a difference to where countries score. So anyway, where we really, I think, are much more confident about comparing the findings is across individuals, because there we have a lot of detailed data on each individual, and we can control for what country they live in, for just different country differences. So here's something that will make you happy or sad depending on where you are. This is happiness and age. This data happened to be for Latin America, where I'm from, but this pattern holds everywhere you study happiness. I've done this in Central Asia, Russia, Europe, Africa, Latin America, the US, and basically there's a U-shaped relationship between happiness and age. Now, this is controlling for being healthy and also for being in a stable partnership, right? So that means that's what, if you have to have those two things to be on this U. And as you'll see, those of you that thought your 20s and 30s were it, you're all wrong. In fact, the low point in the happiness relationship is about 44 for the United States. For this Latin America chart, it's 48 years, and I just turned 49, so I have nowhere to go but up, obviously. And after this sort of low point in the middle-age years, people seem to get monotonically happier until they die. So what explains this? Well, if you think about the middle-age years, it's a point at which, for most people, aspirations align with reality. I mean, if you don't know what you're going to be when you grow up by the time you're 49 or 50, you've got some growing up to do. But most people sort of figure it out, and their aspirations align with what they're able to do. So that eliminates some frustration. It may yield some, and then it goes away. The middle-age years typically also tend to have sort of a double burden of financial burden, often teenage children, young children, and aging parents. There's typically a more pressured time in the life cycle. And then after that, people seem to get happier as they age. There are lots of explanations. One is people may appreciate life more as it seems shorter. Another thing is a selection bias. Basically, happier people live longer. So the unhappy people are dying off as you go up the charts. And then finally, our oldest respondent here was 99, and one could argue maybe there's a senility effect. I don't know. But this relationship is remarkably stable across countries and over time. So what else?
Can I make a comment there?
Oh, sure.
What about when you get older, you don't need to plan too much, so you don't have that worry anymore in your mind? Because your life is almost, as you mentioned, over, so
Right,
there's
you're
not that much
living
plan.
out your plans or your dreams.
Right.
Yeah, no, also, another thing, and I'll show you more findings on this, one thing that is very bad for happiness is uncertainty. And so if you're worried about what your future will be like, that creates anxiety, versus eventually you have a better sense of what your future is. You're living it, and that may be part of it too. I should have mentioned, please feel free to interrupt me. I'm used to Brookings economists who interrupt before you get the first slide up. So, okay, now, don't worry about these numbers. They're regression equations, but the numbers help me remember what to say. So I will talk you through this. This is a comparison of the determinants of happiness other than age across regions, comparing Russia, Latin America, and the US. And the basic point of the slide is to show that for the most part, there are a lot of similarities around the world. So we've discussed age. There are some gender differences. I've been looking at well-being and gender around the world and find that the only places where men are happier than women, because women are happier than men worldwide, are in Russia, which is right there, and then Africa, where if you think about sub-Saharan Africa, we think about the status of women, that finding makes some sense. But generally, women are happier than men. Married people, typically married people are on average happier than non-married people or non-attached people. Marriage and stable partnerships work the same way. Again, Russia's an outlier and married people aren't happier there. Yeah, well, it accords with some of what you read. But in any event, we don't know the direction of causality. There's a selection bias in the sense that is it marriage that makes people happier, or is it that happier people select each other and marry? We have some evidence from overtime data in Germany that the actual effects of just marriage seem to wear out after a year or two. So there's some suggestion that it's a selection bias thing. There's also a wonderful new study by a colleague of mine in France that's called You Can't Be Happier Than Your Wife. And what it shows is that the marriages that are most likely to break up are where you have asymmetries in happiness levels. So it's better to have two happy people married to each other or two unhappy people married to each other, but you don't want a happy person married to an unhappy person because that doesn't work. I can tell you that from my own experience too. Okay. Okay. Income matters to happiness. There's all this question as does money buy you happiness? Well, more and more money doesn't buy you more and more happiness, but being destitute is terrible for happiness or well-being. So it makes sense. So we know everywhere we study happiness that at the individual level that wealthier people are on average happier than poor people. It doesn't mean that more and more money buys you more and more happiness. It doesn't, the relationship is also complex because as people get wealthier, they start to worry about how their income compares to others. There are all sorts of other things that enter into the relationship, but money does matter. Having enough means is obviously important to people's well-being.
Isn't it up to like $75,000 and then it begins to level off like?
That depends on what happiness question you use, okay. Because there's for simply a positive affect, daily living experience kind of well-being, it tapers off at median levels of income. And the explanation there is that navigating, just day-to-day life and negative emotions and everything else is harder if you don't have enough money. But after you have enough money, more money doesn't make you smile more. It won't make you enjoy your day more. But money correlates, or income correlates more closely with happiness in the life evaluation sense as people evaluate their lives as a whole. And again, there I think income is proxying for opportunity and choice. The more means you have, the more choices you can make, the more you can live your life as you wish. So again, the relationship between income and happiness it's quite complex. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide. Education correlates closely with income. Minorities, it depends where you look. In Russia, rather remarkably, minorities are happier than native Russians. But this was at a time that the Soviet Union had collapsed and minorities had sort of a newfound freedom. In Latin America, those who self-report to be a minority rather than their country of origin are less happy than others. And in the U.S., minorities are less happy than non-minorities. That finding is driven by African Americans, though, and not by Hispanics and other races, that there's sort of no difference. Students, those of you that are students in the room will be happy to know that U.S. students are happier than the average for the U.S. And retired people. Here there's some differences. In Russia, retired people are less happy than the average. This is the plight of the Russian pensioners. And in the U.S., retired people are happier than the average. They're on the upside of that U. Okay, just three other quick things. Unemployment. Everywhere we study happiness, unemployment is negatively related with well-being. And that holds across the board. Self-employment, though, varies, and we find in the US and Russia, self-employed people are happier than the average. They're self-employed by choice, typically. They're working in their jeans at home on their computer screen. Versus in Latin America, self-employed people are less happy than the average, and that's because they'd love to have a stable job, and they're self-employed in the informal sector. Lastly, health, and we'll get back to health, but health, whether it's self-reported health or health status measured objectively, is strongly correlated with happiness or well-being. In fact, it usually comes in with a bigger coefficient or more relative weight than income.
I'm curious, when you spoke about minorities, particularly in Latin America, you mentioned self-proclaimed minorities. Especially there's the who's native and who's not is kind of convoluted at this point because there's been so much mixing. Would that data then be not as accurate because if you're so could it be based off of your opinion that you don't
yeah,
belong?
there's a selection. It's a selection bias because you ask people. The question is basically, tell me please, what do you most consider? What do you first identify yourself to be? And the first possible answer is Chilean, Peruvian, Argentinian, or whatever your nationality is. And then it's a whole list of minorities. So people who first identify as whatever that ethnic origin is instead of their country of origin, they may be less happy. They may not feel that they fit in because, as you say, the concept of a minority in Latin America, with the exception of some specific examples, is quite convoluted. There really isn't clear minorities. So yeah, no, that's a good point. Okay, and health, the other thing on health is the causality seems to go in both directions. So we find that health makes people happy, good health, but also happier people are typically healthier. Happiness basically, or positive emotions, I think, they can't cure cancer, but they certainly help people manage chronic conditions, and there's a lot of evidence along those lines. Okay, finally, and really please ignore these numbers because this was a very complicated econometric exercise, but the question we asked here, this was based on Russia data where we had data on income and happiness for the same respondents for several years. We basically said, okay, we know that income causes happiness, but does happiness cause income? Do happier people earn more money, right, in future periods? And so what we did is for each respondent in a first stage regression equation, we isolated what we called unexplained happiness. It was each respondent's happiness level that wasn't explained by their age, their income, their gender, and all the things that we could control for. And then in a second stage, we used each respondent's quote-unquote unexplained happiness, or their residual happiness, their natural happiness, as an independent variable in an equation with income in the next period as the dependent variable. And we found indeed that this unexplained level of happiness was correlated with higher levels of future income. Now, typically, as economists would do, this was criticized, and we were told, well, but it's only because these people could predict that they were happier in the second period. So it really has nothing to do with happiness causing income. It has to do with the fact that they knew they'd be wealthier in the future, and that's why they were happier before. Well, if you lived in Russia in 1995, there weren't many people that could predict what their future income would be in the year 2000. So this was one instance where this sort of funny Russian context actually helped us. We also found that this unexplained happiness residual, that we called it, was correlated with better health in the future too. Again, both of these findings supported by other studies. So let me talk now. This comes down to the basic determinants of happiness, what happiness causes story. Let me talk a little bit about this adaptation conundrum. And as I said, I'd like to show you examples from the economics arena, from the crime and corruption arena, and then from health. So first of all, there's something that we found called the paradox, that I've called the paradox of unhappy growth. And what this is looking at countries worldwide, is that there's clearly a levels effect. So on average, people in countries with higher levels of GDP are happier than those with lower levels of GDP. And if you look, you just look at this slide, and that's obvious, right? There's kind of a general levels effect. But once you control for levels, we find that respondents in countries with higher rates of faster rates of economic growth are actually less satisfied with their lives, less satisfied with their standard of living, and less satisfied with their health. So what's going on? Growth is supposed to be good. It's supposed to be the objective of our economic policy, right? Well, it turns out these findings are driven by fast-growing middle-income developing countries. In other words, it's driven by countries growing very rapidly. So what does very rapid economic growth do? It produces a lot of uncertainty, different changing rewards to different skills. Things are changing rapidly in the economy. That produces unhappiness, basically. Very rapid growth often comes accompanied with high rates of inequality, which also typically is not positively correlated with happiness. And health satisfaction. Think about people in countries like this that they're usually working really, really long hours, which probably isn't good for your health. So there are things about rapid economic growth that seem to be bad for happiness or well-being, even though over the long run we know that growth produces higher levels of income, which are related to happiness. But this certainly helps us understand the process of change and what that does to well-being. People don't like change very much, typically, in terms of happiness. So that relates to something I've found at the micro level, which I've called happy peasants and frustrated achievers. And this is looking at people with high rates of mobility who report that their economic situation is worse than it was before versus people who have had almost no mobility at all. This was in third world countries, Peru and in Russia and now also in China, very similar findings. So people moving up the income ladder very quickly, but they report to be worse off than they were before. And then you have poor peasants that have barely moved at all, and they report to be very happy. So what's going on? It's a little bit the same. The change that accompanies this attaining higher levels of income can often be unsettling. It's often also accompanied by rising aspirations. And the best example here is migrants. We typically find that migrants are less happy than non-migrants in their place of destination, even though their incomes have quintupled, from where the place they left. And when you poke a little more deeply, you find that rural people typically compare their economic situation to how they were a year ago. How was my harvest compared to the year ago? Or how did my household do this year compared to last year? Versus if you ask migrants, they've moved to a new city and all of a sudden their reference norm has changed. And even though their income has quintupled, it doesn't look very good compared to the very wealthy people in the city that they just moved to. So there's a lot in terms of people adapting to different reference norms that then affects their well-being. Okay, here's another rather more extreme example of adaptation, and it's closer to home. This is the Dow Jones Industrial Average and average levels of happiness in the United States during the economic crisis. This is based on daily data from the Gallup organization. So we follow 1,000 Americans a day with very detailed, nationally representative sample. Changes at each day, but the same representation with very detailed questions about well-being.
Are these the same people?
No, they're representative. I wish they were the same people, but that would be a lot to ask somebody to answer every day. So the red lines are average happiness, and the blue line is the Dow. And what's interesting is you'll see when the crisis, the markets started tumbling in January 2008, average happiness levels tumbled as well. Now remember, national average happiness levels don't move very much. They almost don't move at all. And often they move down when things are going well, right? As in the case of Japan. This is an 11% drop during this period, which is a dramatic drop in average levels of well-being. So then what happens? Well, it keeps dropping except for a spike. I think that's at New Year's Day. So I can discount that spike. But when the bottom stopped falling out of the markets right here in about March of 2009, it doesn't mean everything, the crisis ended, but the free fall was over. There was this feeling until then, how far is this going to go? How bad is this crisis going to be? How much are we going to lose? As soon as that sensation sort of ended and the market slowly sputtered up, average happiness levels went way up. Not only did they recover, but they went up to higher than they were before the crisis. The same respondents said their economic situation was worse than it was before. Right? So this isn't a kind of Pollyanna effect. People said, okay, I've lost X, but I know how much I've lost, and now I can cope. Now I can adapt. So again, this is another example that people have a hard time adapting to uncertainty, and they can better adapt to unpleasant certainty. So this doesn't mean that, so this is very useful information, but it's kind of complicated from a policy perspective, right? So growth makes people unhappy. Losing money but having a certain loss, then their happiness increases. What's going on? Well, adaptation is a lot of what's going on here, and it helps us understand human behavior and human well-being, but I think it poses some puzzles for policy. So let me give you examples from 2 other areas, and I'll try and be quick so that we have some time for questions. But one is from the arena of crime. So I was born in Lima, Peru, but about 10 years ago, I came out of my house in Northwest DC. For those of you that know Washington, DC, it's kind of split up, but Northwest DC is very safe in general and not a whole lot of crime. And I was busy waving at my twins who were in the window, and got in the car, and I was in a hurry and tried to leave. The car started and it wouldn't go anywhere. What's going on? So I got out, and my car was on blocks, and the tires had been stolen. So I was outraged. I mean, this doesn't happen in Northwest DC. People don't steal tires off cars. So, I called the police, and my day was ruined, and why me, and terrible day. If it had happened to me in Lima, right, a week later when I was visiting Lima, I would have said, you idiot, why did you leave the car on the street? You knew the tires would get stolen, right? Same person, completely different norms and expectations about crime. So it turns out crime and corruption matter negatively to well-being. Okay, if you're a victim of crime or corruption in the past 12 months, is the question we use, it has a negative effect on well-being. But the effect is mitigated or is less negative when there's more crime and corruption around you, when you're used to it. So let me zip through some. I'm obviously not good with this clicker. Some examples. So here, what we did, this is Latin America. Again, don't worry about the numbers. It helps me remember what I did. What we did here is that we had the question, were you a victim of crime in the past 12 months? And if you were a victim of crime in the past 12 months, it was negatively correlated with your happiness level, which was a dependent variable. But we also created for each respondent a crime residual. We calculated the predicted probability that you would be a crime victim because of your age, your income, your area of residence, your gender, and all these other things. And then we looked at whether you were a crime victim or not, and we were able to isolate the kind of unexplained probability that you'd be a crime victim, which proxies for being somewhere where there's just more random crime around you. We're obviously into residuals, if you can tell, but what we find is that this kind of crime residual, this sort of lots unexplained probability of being a crime victim, lots more crime around you, mitigates the negative effect of being a crime victim. So if you're a victim of crime, it's got a negative effect on well-being, but this unexplained probability of being a crime victim is positively correlated with well-being. It's sort of a mitigating effect. We did the same thing for corruption, and get the exact same finding. So again, being a corruption victim is negative for well-being, but if there's more corruption around you and you're used to it, it mitigates that negative effect. Now, if you don't like our methodology, we did a different thing for Africa, where here we split the sample into respondents who reported to have high levels of personal security in their neighborhood and respondents who reported to have low levels of personal security in their neighborhood. And we found that if you were a crime victim in a neighborhood where you already reported to have low levels of personal security, the negative effect of being a crime victim was lower because you'd adapted to it. You expected to be a crime victim. You didn't feel stigmatized, whatever it might be. And lastly, this is a pretty amazing result. We did this in Afghanistan, where we found that being a victim of crime or corruption had no significant effect on well-being at all because people are so used to it, except in Taliban-influenced districts. Now, these are not violent Taliban districts. This is a pilot survey, so we had 8 districts, and a couple of them had more Taliban presence or influence than the others. And there, if you were a victim of corruption, it had a negative effect on well-being. Why? Corruption rates are much lower, and it's much less expected you'll be a corruption victim, and then corruption did come in negatively. So again, different norms of crime or corruption really seem to mediate the effects on well-being. So lastly, I will give you a couple examples from health, and then we'll turn to policy. Okay, this pretty chart is something called the Millennium Preston curve, and what you have here is GDP per capita on the horizontal axis and life expectancy on the vertical axis. And it turns out, as you look, when countries have very low levels of GDP per capita and income increases just a little bit, life expectancy goes way up, and then it flattens out. So what explains this? Well, the kinds of interventions that are getting low levels of life expectancy up at this level are typically things like oral rehydration, vaccination, things that aren't very expensive, that have big boosts in life expectancy. And so just modest increases in income make a big difference. As countries get healthier and wealthier, it's much harder to increase life expectancy. One, because it's just harder to increase life expectancy from 80 to 90 or 70 to 80 than from 40 to 50. It's just biologically harder. Secondly, the kinds of things that you're trying to do to increase life expectancy don't just require income. They require innovation and luck and scientific developments, like curing certain kinds of cancer. So the question I had looking at this was, did health satisfaction mirror the same pattern? Is there sort of an Easterlin paradox in health satisfaction? Well, it turns out that health satisfaction is all over the map. And I don't have complete evidence. I can't replicate that chart with health satisfaction yet, but I have some good evidence that tolerance varies a lot across countries and across cultures. And so I mentioned earlier on that health satisfaction is as high in Kenya as it is in the US. And health satisfaction, so people's satisfaction with their own health, is higher in Guatemala than it is in Chile, when Chilean health standards are like OECD standards or even better, and Guatemalan health standards are close to sub-Saharan African ones. So that makes no sense. It turns out that national average health satisfaction is only weakly correlated with GDP per capita, and negatively correlated with the economic growth rate. Health satisfaction is weakly and positively correlated with life expectancy, as you would expect, but it's also positively correlated with the infant mortality rate, which makes no sense at all. So it turns out that variables that capture cultural differences matter more to health satisfaction than expected indicators do. So norms of health vary tremendously across cultures, countries, people, and that makes a big difference in terms of how satisfied people feel they are with their health. The most extreme case in some very poor places where I've worked is that very poor people don't report to be ill. You see these low disease rates. Well, it's just because poor people don't report illness. They go to work unless they absolutely can't walk. So norms of health really vary. Let me show you one other example. I mentioned this work on obesity and well-being, and it turns out that the obese are less happy on average than the non-obese. This is US data. But it turns out that if you're obese in a high obesity cohort, it bothers you less to be obese to your well-being. This is in addition to the health conditions. And if you're obese in a low obesity cohort, you're much more miserable. So just to give you an example, the base impact of obesity on happiness is 0.57 standard deviations on a depression scale. This is a depression scale, not a happiness scale. So with the base case comparison being white obese people with income in the middle income quintile living in a non-urban area in the East. So compared to that base case, if you are obese and you're Hispanic or black, where obesity rates are much higher, the negative effect is mitigated, so you're less unhappy about being obese. And if you're obese and you're in any region compared to the East, where obesity rates are the lowest, again, you get a big mitigating effect, so it bothers you less. And if you're obese and you live in a city where obesity rates are lower, then you're more unhappy. And we also did this with professional cohorts and found that the effect was even greater, because typically people will compare themselves to people in their professional cohort, more than to some bigger reference norm. So if you depart for the weight norm for your professional cohort, the unhappiness effects are quite high. So it turns out if you're obese and you work at Walmart, there isn't much of a negative happiness effect. And if you're obese and you work on Wall Street, you're pretty miserable. So and that's an insight, but it's also showing how bad equilibrium can replicate themselves. So you have people in a bad health, bad poverty trap, right? Again, the well-being surveys give us insights, but it's difficult to directly translate this to policy. So let me conclude with just a couple words about policy, if I can remember how this clicker works. I'm going backwards. It's not what I want to do. Okay, here we go. All right. So as I mentioned, these surveys really help us get at a lot of questions that standard revealed preferences-based approaches can't answer very well, such as the welfare effects of different environments, institutional arrangements, norms, health conditions, financial insecurity. From a research perspective, the world is our oyster with these surveys. There's so many things that we can look at. The well-being effects of commuting time, of environmental pollution, of you name it. And that really provides us with an exciting new research tool with clear implications for policy questions. However, this individual ability to adapt to both prosperity and adversity, I think, throws a monkey wrench into the equation and makes it a little more difficult. How do we deal with all of this? And also, I think that as I said, at the individual level, this capacity to adapt to adversity is a good protective mechanism, but at the collective level, it can result in societies getting stuck in bad equilibrium. And the examples from crime and corruption, obesity, bad health norms. I mean, if people have Kenyan-level health standards and report to be very satisfied with their health, that just is going to prolong, bad health. And also, from the economics arena, it's clear that people are better able to adapt to unpleasant certainty than they are to uncertainty, even uncertainty that's associated with positive progress. So again, important information for policymakers, but it's not so easy to directly translate that finding into a policy recommendation. And I think it raises a note of caution about directly applying happiness surveys to policy. Meanwhile, I'm quite involved in trying to disentangle how to do that. One issue, I think, though, is that the definition of happiness that you use can play an important mediating role in all of this. And so happiness surveys as a research tool work because they don't define happiness for the respondent. So, generally speaking, how happy are you with your life? And people just answer in an open-ended way, and then we find consistent patterns across people all over the world. But happiness as a policy objective, in my view, requires a definition. And here there are different components of happiness, and as we've gotten more sophisticated, we're able to isolate them and ask different questions that get at different ones. And so there's happiness as contentment, something that economists call hedonic utility. A simpler word is just contentment or day-to-day experiences in the Benthamite sense, right? And then there's happiness defined in a eudaimonic or Aristotelian sense as the opportunity to lead a fulfilling life. And there's some new research, and that question about the 75K cap, I think, might have come from that, which shows that this experience or hedonic utility correlates much less closely with income than does evaluative or eudaimonic utility, both in the US and around the world. So in other words, more money doesn't make you enjoy your day-to-day activities more after a certain point, but more money or more income or more means make you evaluate or allow you to evaluate your life more positively, I think because we have more choices. And there's some empirical evidence, some of my own, that is suggestive. So when you look around the world, friendships and family, and in particular the best data for this come from Latin America, but it shows up in other ways. Friendships and family and religion matter more to the happiness of the poor, in other words, in a relative weight sense, versus work and health seem to matter more to the happiness of the rich. These are rough categories, above and below median income. So you could conclude from that that the rich are greedy jerks. Or you could think, wait a minute, what's going on here? Well, for the poor, friendships and family are a safety net. That's what you've got in the absence of other safety nets. And in the absence, and you need those safety nets, particularly if your opportunities are limited. Versus work and health are what allow people with means to pursue the lives that they want to pursue. So as you think about this, I'm positing that agency, people's capacity to make a choice, probably plays a critical mediating role in terms of the definition of happiness that people think about or select into as they answer these surveys. Okay? So people are going to select the definition of happiness that they're capable of having, right? So if you happen to live in Afghanistan and you don't have a whole lot of choices, you're probably going to focus on your day-to-day experience and your friendships or whatever else it might be as you assess your happiness, right? Versus think of the example of a driven scientist who's trying to cure cancer. You may be less content in a day-to-day sense, particularly when his or her experiment doesn't work that day, or in my case, you run a huge econometric model and the findings are all backwards and bad day or whatever. But in the life evaluation sense, having the capacity to do something fulfilling with your life is probably the dimension of happiness or well-being that you think of most when you evaluate your happiness. And in thinking about this agency question and in thinking about happy peasants and frustrated achievers, and I conclude my Pursuit of Happiness book this way, I think the worst kind of society may be that which promises opportunity and the pursuit of happiness, as we do in our Declaration of Independence, but doesn't give its citizens the agency to do so. In other words, you raise expectations, but you don't give people means. Versus a more traditional society where there are a lot of happy peasants will probably be a less miserable society if you're not sort of promising. I'm not saying it's a better society, I'm just saying it's a less miserable society if you're not promising people the pursuit of something that they can't attain. So I think here's an example of where these surveys, the whole concept of well-being and happiness, can make us think a lot about the kind of society that we want to have or that we want to pursue. And that's coming up very much in terms of this National Academy of Sciences panel on how can we use well-being metrics, what are the limits, what kinds of questions will putting them out in our data and statistics pose for us as a society. But this is all a new and a rather still uncertain art, and like anything else, we're working to get the science right, and hopefully before the increased media publicity, now happiness is in the media all the time, before the increased media publicity gets the better of us. And I'll stop there, and I hopefully have time for a couple questions.
If you have the goal of policy to try and increase happiness, how do you account for things like right now with high unemployment? We end up with a lot of people staying in jobs that they're absolutely miserable with because they're afraid of losing their health insurance. But if the unemployment rate were to drop significantly, that policy becomes irrelevant. How do you go about tying the two together?
Well, there's a distinction I probably didn't make very well in this whole policy arena. I think where there's a lot of confidence is that we can use well-being metrics, measuring different dimensions and components of happiness as a way to evaluate the success of policy, as a way to help design policy. So knowing that long-term unemployment is terrible for well-being, I think helps us think through what our unemployment policy should be like. We can evaluate policy interventions. What are well-being levels like before and after a policy intervention? All of that's, I think, doable. Having happiness as an objective of policy per se, I think is a much more controversial question. And particularly, I think, because of this whole progress paradox thing, that change, you often need change to achieve, progress or to get better growth in the long run or better economic situations in the long run, we have to reduce the fiscal deficit now. And that short-term policy is going to probably decrease happiness in the short term. And then you have the question of whose happiness, our happiness, our children's happiness, intertemporal things. So in my view, the metrics can really help us inform policy in very useful and insightful ways. Having happiness or well-being as the objective of policy is something we haven't fully gotten our heads around yet.
I think the Occupy protest going on right now is because of a lot of unhappiness. But I think the communities they create, they're pretty happy in.
The communities they create.
Well, at least they have some friends. They're all in the same community. Say you're protesting, you're intense, but you're having that community of like-minded individuals. Right?
Well, there you're on to two things, I think. One, yes, there's the unhappiness that's created by these haves and have-nots, or unemployment, or all these other things that the protesters are trying to articulate. Maybe not always very eloquently, but secondly, there are the positive well-being effects that come from getting up and doing something about it, even if it's protesting. We find, for example, that just based on a study in Swiss cantons where everybody benefits from public goods that come from democracy, but only domestic nationals are allowed to participate in democracy. And it turns out that there's a positive well-being effect that comes from participating in democracy, and we also find it participating in social activities and other things. That the doing, the collective doing of things seems to have positive well-being effects.
Yeah, sorry, this might be a naive question, but you mentioned adaptation as being what we had to Dow Jones draw here, and adaptation, of course, is always a difficult thing when you're talking about humans. But you have a score that says this is a happiness score between 1 and 10 or 0 and 10. How do you know that you're actually, the score that you predicted in 2007 when you started this versus 2009, that the metric that you used to come up with that number is correct before and after this event? Meaning, you say happiness is some sort of equation which takes into account all these variables, and that maps to a number. But how do you know that that functional mapping is actually appropriate? Or, you say this, it could be adaptation, or is it really just the case that whatever you were measuring before was actually not capturing what happiness is here? Right.
Well, it's not a naive question at all. It's quite a difficult one, but I think you've got two things going on. I just want to explain this a little better. There's no equation for this particular slide. So these are just average happiness levels. So it's people's scores on a 1 to 10 point life satisfaction scale. And we're looking simply at how they changed. So there's no assumption. I mean, maybe the question's not a good question, but it was an equally bad question before and after. So there's no change, right? The deeper question that you raise is, are we imposing or thinking about the right function as we put all these things into an equation? Again, there could be some error there, and there surely is error, and there's a lot of happiness that's just individual, genetic and psychological that we can't explain with these other factors. But in terms of the variables that we put into the equations, they really hold across so many people, across time, across countries, across cultures, as being the main things that matter, that seem to come out significantly, that it's kind of hard to say, oh no, we should put in swimming instead or something, as opposed to these kind of standard variables that keep popping out in a big way. Wow.
You alluded in your last slide to publicity. What would worry you the most about the media taking this and doing something with this, or our political parties taking this and doing something with this?
Right. Well, the media typically, I get these people that call me up and say, can you tell me, can you talk about how to be happy? And I'm not saying I don't do that. I'm a non-key economist. I'm not telling people how to be happy. I look at the data, but so the media sort of takes it in the direction of self-help and how to be happy, and that's actually kind of harmless. I think the second example you raise is the politician's example, which is some of these findings, like change makes people unhappy, or we know inflation isn't good for happiness, or crime and corruption is less bad for happiness when there's more of it. All of those things could be misconstrued, politically quite easily. Republicans are happier than Democrats. Another example. Well, why is that? I'm not completely sure, but it's consistent finding for the U.S. I think it has to do with the fact that Republicans typically think things are okay the way they are, in the sense that people work for whatever they got, and Democrats are much more worried about changing things. Well, again, any of those findings tossed into a misconstrued political debate could be misleading. Or the paradox of unhappy growth. That it could lead to a complete, this is an anti-progress agenda, which it's not. We're just showing that there's a difference between levels and changes, and that change makes people unsettled and unhappy in the short term. That's an insight into policy design, in my view, but it's a much more complicated issue if it gets tossed into a political debate where all of a sudden people are saying growth is bad for happiness. So there are any number of examples you could think about.
As you talked about, for example, the crime rate, is there an implied correlation at all to expectations? So, and how would that tie into policy, if so? Because if you expect that you live in a crime rate and you have your wheels taken off the car if you leave it out in front of your house, whereas in another community it doesn't, and yet if you get into raising expectations, whether it's managing a company or managing governmental relations, does that impact happiness? And can that agitate?
Right. Well, expectations are huge in the crime example and in many others. So, another one to give you is that freedom and democracy matter to happiness, right, or well-being around the world. So people that live in places with more freedom and more democracy are, on average, happier than those with less. But freedom and democracy matter more to the happiness of people in places that have freedom and democracy because they expect it, right? So for the crime example, if you expect high rates of crime, and everybody expects high rates of crime, there's a disincentive to behaving honestly. In fact, it's sort of, if everybody expects to pay bribes, and you're the lone idiot that doesn't do it, you're the one that ends up in jail. So that's where you get this kind of collective low expectations and self-fulfilling prophecies. And how that translates into a business sense, I mean, you can imagine whether it's risk-taking or, how profits are done, or think about, the Enron scandals when it became normal to inflate price-earnings ratios. And again, if people expect that that's the norm, it doesn't bother them, you start to see bad outcomes because of that.
Well, and changing that to policy even for government. If you try and set expectations, you can cause distress.
Absolutely.
We take one more question?
I was just curious about, in the research, if you involved people from linguistic studies, because the word happiness, especially across different cultures and across different groups, depending on what you're looking for, the definition of happiness may not always apply. So contentment, happiness, satisfaction, fulfillment, well-being, all of those things have different implications, different things that are associated with them for each separate individual across cultures and countries. I was just wondering, is that something that's going to be explored, or is it something that...
Well, no, there's a lot of work on it. I mean, the individual is the least problem, because you have so many individuals that you sort of are able to, basically, I'm sure there's some error, but at a certain point you've got such large numbers that you can account, the error gets washed out. But Across cultures, there's a big issue. Certainly the Asian cultures, apparently there's some, I don't know how linguistic it is, or it seems to correlate with other kinds of affect, other sorts of things that theoretically drive the Asian responses down slightly in relative terms. There is a lot of work being done on different questions. So what is remarkable, though, is using different questions from the ladder of life question, how does your life compare to the best possible life, versus generally speaking, how happy are you with your life? The sort of standard patterns, they may vary a little bit, but they really hold across, tons of different countries and cultures and people. So the linguistic question can play a role, and sometimes when you look at a particular country, but for the overall picture, it doesn't make that much difference.
I'm sorry to bring this to a close. Let me thank Carol. For those of you who still have questions, we'll be here, so we'll be happy to take them offline, but we do promise and try and get you out of here on time. So thanks for coming, and we hope we'll see you in January.